Hi everyone, thanks for joining for this talk on inflation. I'll be explaining how we measure inflation, why it's important, and I'll build you through how we get from the single number that you see in newspaper headlines to an in-depth read on the state of the economy. Let's start with a definition of what inflation is. It's a measurement of how much prices are changing for things households spend on. When we talk about inflation rates, the change that we're talking about is often a change over the year. So for example, the Reserve Bank's inflation target of 2 to 3% is a target for inflation over the year of 2 to 3%. But we also often talk about changes in the quarter, typically when we want to focus on a more recent development. Australia's main measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, and that index only covers prices of consumer goods and services. The prices that businesses charge other businesses for products isn't included, and neither are households' investments into the stock market. But that still leaves many things included in the CPI. So the CPI covers housing, food, education, recreation, everything from cheese to childcare. The CPI is also a weighted index, which means that the price changes for things that households spend more of make a larger contribution to the final index. An increase in rents, for example, is going to contribute more than an increase in stationery prices. So let's illustrate an example of how this aggregation can work. So we have a very simple economy with books and toys, and we go out in one year and we measure some prices. In the next year, we come back and record those prices again and find things have changed. So we can calculate an inflation rate for just books and just toys, 2.5% and 4.7%. And to calculate our aggregated index, if households spend just equally on toys and books, we would end up calculating an inflation rate right in between 2.5 and 4.7%. But if households tend to spend a lot more on books than toys, then that inflation rate on aggregate is going to be much closer to 2.5%. In the real world CPI, there's not two products, there's 87 low-level indices, all with their different weights. So one of these details includes quality adjustments that are made to individual components. So these try to keep price comparisons on a like-to-like basis. So for example, if the sticker price of some confectionaries in supermarkets stay the same, but the quantity included in the actual bar of chocolate decreases, this still counts as price inflation. You have to pay more to get the same thing. Similarly, if the quality of some products increase, then there's an adjustment in the other direction for that. This often happens for cars and electronic products when new features are added. The weights in the CPI also don't stay the same for all the products. They're adjusted over time as households change what they spend on. Even so, the CPI is still subject to what we call substitution bias. This is a bias that occurs because when prices increase for a particular product, households tend to spend less on them, particularly when similar substitutes are available. So for example, if prices increase quite quickly for takeaway food, households might substitute away by buying more groceries and cooking more meals at home. The weights in the CPI take some time to respond to this, so there's a bit of an upward bias because the items with higher rates of inflation are a little bit overweighted. Sensitivity to location is another limitation. For data collection reasons, the coverage of the CPI is limited to Australia's 8 capital cities. The CPI is also sort of an aggregated, averaged index. And this is the kind of index that we want if we want to understand big, broad macroeconomic trends, but it means that the CPI is unlikely to be representative of any single household's experience. So for example, childcare, the CPI is around 1%, but that's the average of households who spend nothing on childcare at all and households who spend a lot more on it. So with all our definitions and calculations out of the way, let's take a look at the actual CPI. It's a very interesting time to talk about inflation right now, as Jackie said, You've probably heard about it and experienced it yourself even. Prices have been increasing quite a bit. So this graph shows inflation over the year, that's the dark line, and also the quarterly movements in the bars. And the movement over the year is essentially just the accumulation of 4 quarters of data, or 4 of these bars here. So inflation has increased quite a bit recently. The latest data for March 2022 had year-ended inflation increasing to 5.1%. So sort of over the course of this graph, from that previous peak in 2008, which was just eclipsed, inflation started moving down with soft demand in the economy amid weak labour market outcomes contributing to part of that slowing. This more recent pickup, though, has been contributed to by rising costs for goods and materials, as well as strong demand that's enabled firms to pass on some of those increased input costs. Stronger conditions in the domestic labour market have also been a factor for this. To help break out sort of all the price movements in the different bits and pieces that are part of the CPI, I'm going to group a lot of these components together by their common characteristics and behaviours and talk about them bit by bit. And the first 2 groups I'm going to cover is groceries and consumer durables. These are both physical goods which are sold in retailers. They also both tend to be more sensitive to changes in import prices. So let's start with a dive into consumer durable items. These make up a bit under 1/5 of the CPI by weight. These graphs show how the price level for these items have changed over time. Motor vehicle prices, the graph in the top left, have been on a fairly steady decline just until the start of the pandemic. Since then, stronger demand and constraints on global production from semiconductor shortages have boosted prices substantially in Australia. It's a pretty similar experience to what's happened overseas in other countries as well. This has been mirrored for many other consumer durable items which have broken their trends and either had price increases or have ceased that normal trend and stayed the same. It's not just the cost of imported goods themselves, but also increases in the cost of shipping which have contributed to this. As the world started to spend more of their money on physical goods under lockdown restrictions, shipping across the globe has struggled to meet this extra volume. These different items are great examples of where input costs tend to drive inflation. Because many of these goods are imported, the exchange rate also has a generally important influence on these prices, but it does take some time to pass through. That being said, the story across durable and retail goods is not always dominated by input costs. Before the pandemic, retail prices had been affected by intensified competition. As new businesses entered the Australian market, offshore online retailers became more prevalent and accessible to Australians, and as the internet's made it easier for consumers to check prices online and compare them. This has driven prices lower, particularly for clothing retailers in this top right graph, where that competition has been more intense. Right now, increases in input costs are the driving factor behind prices, but the retail sector does still seem to be quite competitive. So some of these items are also where we tend to see a lot of quality adjustments, specifically for increased quality. Even when the prices of new cars or televisions stay the same, they almost always have new features or new technologies. And this is one of the reasons why these items have been on a trend decline over time. You can see for audiovisual and computing services that trend decline has really been quite steep. And this includes TVs and computers, which we all know processing power has increased rapidly over time. So let's move on now from manufactured goods into food and drink items, also called groceries. So grocery inflation has also been affected by increased competitive behaviour between Australian retailers, which you can see from around post-2010, where that darker year-ended line has become much lower on average compared to beforehand. Examples of these competitive events include the entrance of Aldi into Australia, as well as more prevalent everyday low price strategies in supermarkets. But in contrast to many of the imported goods that I was just talking about before, the dynamics for grocery price inflation in Australia are a bit different because Australia produces a lot of this food. This means domestic weather events play a larger role in determining prices. Just before the start of the pandemic, grocery prices were on this increase, partly because of drought-related supply disruptions. More recently, grocery prices have been increasing again, with higher import costs, fertiliser and transport contributing to that. Before I move on, let's just hold on for a moment, because this wouldn't be a proper talk from an economist if there wasn't something slightly interesting hidden in a footnote somewhere. So this graph actually excludes fruit and vegetables. We make this exclusion because fruit and vegetable prices are quite volatile, but I'm still going to show it to you on the right here. So fruit and vegetable prices are more volatile because they're more sensitive to weather events. And you can see that there's really sometimes some very big swings up and down. And note also that the scales on this graph are quite different. 6% here for groceries with 40% for fruit and vegetable prices. So some of those two big peaks in fruit and vegetable prices, inflation, were caused by cyclones in 2006 and 2011, which disrupted food production. So with consumer durable goods and food inflation, that's a large coverage of retail good items. But let's talk now about different kinds of inflation. So this next graph shows inflation for market services. This group includes all kinds of services provided by businesses, such as restaurants, takeaway, cinemas, and domestic travel. These make up a little over 1/5 of the CPI. Because workers are a fundamental part of providing a service, market services inflation tends to have a closer link to the labour market and things like wages growth. Unemployment increased substantially from 2012 to 2014 as demand in the economy faltered at that time. Because of this, wages growth slowed substantially after. And you can see that this has been linked to a slowing in market services inflation as well. More recently, market services inflation has picked up. And at this stage, it's not clear that wage costs are fully driving these inflation outcomes, but it is an important sign. The next part of the CPI basket that I wanted to talk through are items where the government plays a significant role in price changes, including through regulation or by subsidising a large portion of the prices themselves. We call this group administered prices, and they're another 1/5 of the CPI basket. Examples of these prices include charges for secondary education and university, as well as health services and pharmaceutical products. Administered prices can behave very differently to other parts of the CPI because the government doesn't need to set prices in response to market forces. In fact, it can often lean against them. The downward movement in administered prices in 2020, this spike here, is a good example of this. This change was mostly driven by childcare prices. The government decided to make childcare free for a few months of this year. This effectively meant that there was a very large reduction in the price, which you can see flowing through to overall administered prices in this graph. First in that large spike down, and then when childcare fees resumed, in that boost back up as prices returned to their previous levels. Some of the larger trends in administered prices can often end up as a reflection of other prices in the economy, as government authorities frequently set prices with reference to recent outcomes in the CPI. Another trend going on in administered prices that's seen prices being a little bit stronger on average than other parts of the CPI is a structural shift in demand towards areas that tend to be administered, like health services. So far on this little tour, we've covered about 70% of the CPI. One of the final parts that I wanted to talk through is rents. So this is only a single item, but it has a fairly big share in the CPI of around 6% by itself. And you can see on this chart that I've split rents up by different locations. So we have Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. And Sydney and Melbourne, being bigger cities and also with larger rent payments, have a larger share in the CPI rents. So regional differences do occur to some extent for almost all prices in the economy, but there's a good reason to think about rents in particular by different cities. Firstly, it's obvious, but rental properties can't move between cities. Owners of apartments in Perth can't take their lands and units and ship them over to Sydney just because rents are higher there. In addition to this, the changes in the supply of rental properties tends to happen pretty slowly. The portion of properties that we build is a very small share of the total stock. This means that excess demand and excess supply can often build up in different cities. So rents in Sydney and Melbourne have been fairly weak over the past 3 years. Over the pandemic, there was an increase in the supply of long-term rental properties as properties that were previously used for travel accommodation were moved into that market because in the midst of the pandemic, nobody was going for holidays and using those properties. So there was an increase in the supply of long-term rentals, and that drove rents down. Population growth also played a role because population growth is part of the demand for rentals. Population growth was reduced because of border closures. But in Perth, rents have behaved a bit differently. They've picked up quite a bit. I'm actually from Perth, so I hear a lot of stories about this myself. This is partly tied to stronger economic conditions in Perth. The unemployment rate there is a fair bit lower than in other states, but probably more importantly, it reflects a limited supply of rental properties from slowed construction over the preceding years. But there are signs that rental inflation is going to pick up across Australia. So advertised rents, this series shown in purple, is a good leading indicator for rents. The transmission between advertised rents and CPI rents can still be slow though. In general, rent inflation tends to be pretty persistent because only a small portion of the rental stock is actually re-rented at any given point in time. So it takes a while for increased prices from the market to transmit through to every tenant. Still, based on these indicators, rents seem set for a pickup overall. Okay, so rents are one important part of housing, but they naturally beg the question, what about homeowners? What share of the CPI is house prices? Well, house prices themselves are actually not a part of the CPI, and there's good conceptual reasons behind this. Partly, housing is an investment, and most houses on the market already exist, so they're not tied to any direct production of anything, which is what the CPI is trying to capture. It's just mostly changing the ownership of an existing home, and almost always from one household to another household. And the CPI is also an average index across households. So an increase in house prices is, it's good for the household selling the house, it's not so good for the household that's just about to buy, but on average you can think about it as probably neutral for households overall, sort of consistent with it having no contribution to the CPI. What the CPI does capture though is the portion of the established housing market which reflects actual new production of stuff, and that's the construction of new homes. So we call this new dwelling inflation, and it's the orange line in the top panel here. So both supply and demand are very important in this market. Just before the pandemic, new dwelling inflation was pretty weak, with prices basically unchanged around 2019. This reflected a decline in demand, as shown by the commencement of new property construction in this blue line, but a weakness in the inflation of building materials, an important input cost to the construction of new dwellings, also contributed to those weak outcomes. Since then though, inflation for dwelling construction has really picked up quite a bit, and both demand and those supply costs have made a contribution. You can see that increase in demand there, and the increase in building materials inflation. Demand in particular has also been boosted by home builder and some other state government incentives to construct homes. But I know that Lucy Ellis has already talked through this slide a little earlier in the day, so I won't labour it any further. So stepping back now and looking back to our headline total measure of CPI, one of the things that you might have observed through these sort of detailed stories is that not every price movement in the CPI necessarily reflects fundamental macroeconomic pressure. So for example, that decline in childcare prices, which I talked about before, didn't really reflect anything to do with macroeconomic forces, but it did cause a pretty big spike down in the CPI, which you can see here. It also wasn't reflective of broader household experiences because, as I said before, not every household uses childcare. So one measure that we use to get a broad sense of underlying inflation pressure is called trimmed mean inflation, shown in this brown line. Trimmed mean inflation is calculated by removing some of the largest and smallest price movements from inflation in every quarter. And you can see that this cuts through a lot of the volatility in these series. So there's times where headline spikes up and then down that trimmed mean smooths through. This underlying series is helpful because it responds more to macroeconomic drivers than one-off events. So some of the episodes which this underlying measure smooths through are temporary supply disruptions from weather events, like those two cyclones that I mentioned earlier. So through the graphs that I've talked through today, there's often been a lot of detail. Sometimes it's hard to think about how these kind of smaller stories reconciles with our textbook macroeconomic models. It's a little bit hard to see the forest through the trees. For instance, I haven't talked much about inflation expectations as we've been going through these components, but we still think those play an important role in determining inflation. The big picture forces are still important. Trim mean inflation is one good measure of that big picture. So headline inflation, as I said before, was 5.1% over the year in the latest data, but two components made a very outsized contribution to that. That was new dwelling inflation that I talked about just before, but fuel prices have also increased a lot and made a large contribution to inflation over the year. Just those two components contribute to a little less than half of that total increase in headline inflation. But trim mean inflation has also picked up, and it's moved past our 2 to 3% target for inflation. And that's one of the indicators that we have right now that price increases have really broadened out across the CPI. So before we go into the Q&A, I also wanted to discuss why we care about inflation and why the Reserve Bank has an inflation target. So what is particularly bad about high inflation? One of the textbook reasons is the cost of changing prices. So literally the cost of having to frequently update sticker prices on various things. This is relevant, but in the modern world, these costs are probably reduced a fair deal with modern information technology and supply chains. More important, in my view, is the cost of uncertainty. When inflation is high, it's also going to be more volatile. If you're trying to make plans, a business making investments, loaning a friend money, or negotiating what you're going to be paid next year, it's really helpful to be more certain about what prices are. In fact, you might be held back from making a decision just because of some uncertainty. So when the rate of inflation is controlled, this uncertainty is reduced and it's easier to make decisions. Another reason that it turns out to be helpful to have an inflation target is that it often ends up playing a dual role. And that second role is actually one of the RBA's monetary policy objectives, to achieve low unemployment. And our inflation target helps achieve this because inflation and unemployment are fundamentally linked. When unemployment is high, there are people out there who want to work, but there's just not enough demand in the economy for businesses to hire them and get them to produce more things. In the same environment, businesses aren't also going to be increasing their prices very much because demand is weak. Inflation isn't then just a thing on its own, it's this signal for how the economy is going relative to its capacity. And demand can also push past capacity of the economy to produce things. When businesses have trouble making or acquiring more products to sell, they'll increase prices of the things they do have. And this kind of ends up as a speed limit on spending. If the economy ends up with a bit of extra money circling around, that money just can't make extra things out of the thin air itself. Our country has to be able to produce things for all the money that's spent, or prices will increase to absorb that. So when we target inflation, we tend to smooth out the economic process a fair deal. Sometimes we add an extra bit of wind into the sails. Sometimes we take a bit out to slow things down when the wind is blowing too strong. This is also why we want to dive in and understand all the different drivers of inflation. We need to know if demand is strong because the Australian economy is at its capacity and how ongoing those constraints are going to be. So how temporary are all these cost pressures that we've seen across the different parts of the CPI? Where will inflation settle over the next few years? There's a considerable amount of uncertainty around that, but we do publish forecasts for inflation, but I'll leave those for Tom Rosewall to discuss with you a little later in today's sessions.